Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. At 28, she worked as a marketing executive for a prestigious firm in downtown Seattle, drove a sleek BMW, and lived in a penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. Her friends envied her seemingly perfect life, complete with designer clothes and invitations to the city's most exclusive events. But, beneath the polished exterior, Sarah felt empty. The corporate world that had once excited her now felt like a prison of endless meetings and meaningless presentations. Her last relationship had ended 6 months ago when her ex-boyfriend, a successful lawyer, had called her emotionally unavailable and too focused on material success. The words stung because they held a grain of truth. On a crisp October morning, Sarah's world began to shift in an unexpected direction. Her company had assigned her to work on a marketing campaign for a luxury outdoor gear company, and the project required her to visit their manufacturing facility in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, nestled in the Cascade Mountains about 2 hours east of Seattle. The drive to Pine Ridge was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in years. As she navigated the winding mountain roads, her phone lost signal, and, for the first time in months, she couldn't check her emails or social media. The silence was both unsettling and oddly peaceful. Towering evergreens lined the road, their branches heavy with morning dew, and snow-capped peaks pierced the clear blue sky in the distance. Pine Ridge was a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Main Street was lined with weathered wooden storefronts, a small diner called Mountain View Cafe, and a general store that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. Sarah felt completely out of place in her tailored business suit and high heels as she parked outside the outdoor gear company's modest office building. The meeting with the company executives went smoothly, but it was during lunch at the Mountain View Cafe that Sarah's life took an unexpected turn. She had chosen a corner booth and was reviewing her notes when she noticed a commotion near the kitchen. A large, bearded man in flannel and work boots was helping an elderly waitress who had dropped a tray of dishes. "Don't worry about it, Helen," the man said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that made Sarah look up from her laptop. "These things happen. Let me help you clean this up." The man, who appeared to be in his early 30s, moved with surprising grace for someone of his size. He was tall, probably 6'3", with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor and hands that looked capable of building or fixing anything. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, and his beard was neatly trimmed but gave him a rugged, outdoorsy appearance that was completely foreign to Sarah's urban world. As he bent to pick up the broken plates, Sarah found herself studying his profile. There was something about his face that drew her attention, perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes or the way he smiled at the flustered waitress with genuine concern. When he finished helping, he didn't make a show of it or seek recognition, he simply patted Helen on the shoulder reassuringly and returned to his own table. Sarah realized she had been staring when the man's eyes met hers across the cafe. For a moment, neither of them looked away. His eyes were a deep green, like the forest that surrounded the town, and they held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. When he smiled a genuine, unguarded expression, Sarah felt her heart skip a beat in a way that hadn't happened in years. The spell was broken when Helen approached Sarah's table with a coffee pot. "More coffee, dear?" the older woman asked, her face still flushed from embarrassment. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, then found herself asking, "That man who helped you, does he come in here often?" Helen's face brightened. "Oh, that's Jake Morrison. He's one of the good ones, that boy. Lives up on his grandfather's old property in the mountains. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always willing to lend a hand when someone needs it. Makes the best furniture you've ever seen too, all handcrafted, beautiful work." Sarah nodded, filing away this information despite herself. She tried to return to her work, but found her eyes wandering back to Jake's table. He was reading a worn paperback book while eating what appeared to be a simple sandwich, completely absorbed in his reading. There was something refreshing about his lack of pretense, the way he seemed comfortable in his own skin without needing to impress anyone. When Jake finished his meal and prepared to leave, he stopped by Helen's station near the kitchen. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched as he handed Helen what appeared to be money, probably a generous tip, based on the woman's grateful expression. As he headed toward the door, Jake's path took him past Sarah's table. "Excuse me," Sarah found herself saying before she could stop herself. I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help but notice what you did for Helen. That was very kind. Jake paused, his expression slightly surprised but not unwelcoming. It wasn't anything special, he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested he wasn't originally from the Pacific Northwest. Helen's been working hard all her life. She doesn't need the stress of worried about broken dishes on top of everything else. Most people wouldn't take the time to help, Sarah said, then extended her hand. I'm Sarah Martinez. Jake Morrison, he replied, shaking her hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and Sarah noticed the calluses that spoke of manual labor. You're not from around here. It wasn't a question, and Sarah smiled. Is it that obvious? Jake's eyes took in her business attire with what might have been amusement. Just a little. What brings you to Pine Ridge? Work, Sarah said, then found herself elaborating. I'm working on a marketing campaign for an outdoor deer company. It's my first time in this area. What do you think of it? Sarah looked around the cafe, taking in the mismatched furniture, the handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and the obvious warmth between the staff and customers. It's different from what I'm used to. But there's something appealing about it. Jake nodded thoughtfully. It's not for everyone, but some of us find everything we need right here. There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah curious about his story, but before she could ask anything else, Jake glanced at the old clock on the cafe wall. I should get going, he said. I've got some work to finish before dark. It was nice meeting you, Sarah. You too, she replied, watching as he headed for the door. Just before he left, he turned back. If you're interested in seeing some of the area while you're here, the trail up to Lookout Point offers a great view of the valley. It's about a 20-minute hike from the trailhead on Mountain Road. And then, he was gone, leaving Sarah with a strange mixture of curiosity and disappointment. She tried to return to her work, but found her mind wandering to the conversation and the unexpected way Jake had made her feel more present and aware than she'd felt in months. That evening, Sarah found herself staying at the Pine Ridge Inn, a small bed and breakfast rather than driving back to Seattle as she had originally planned. She told herself it was because she wanted to explore the area for the marketing campaign, but deep down, she knew it had more to do with the possibility of seeing Jake again. The next morning, Sarah surprised herself by packing hiking boots, something she hadn't worn since college, and driving to the trailhead Jake had mentioned. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. As she began the hike up to Lookout Point, Sarah felt the stress of her city life beginning to melt away. The trail was well maintained but challenging, winding through dense forest before opening onto rocky outcroppings that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Sarah had forgotten how good it felt to move her body in natural surroundings, to breathe air that wasn't filtered through office buildings and car exhaust. When she reached Lookout Point, Sarah was breathless, both from the climb and from the view that spread out before her. The entire Pine Ridge Valley was laid out like a painting, with the small town nestled between rolling hills and surrounded by forests that blazed with autumn colors. In the distance, snow-capped peaks rose like ancient sentinels, and a ribbon of silver marked the course of the Pine River. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah spun around, startled, to find Jake emerging from a different trail. He was carrying a large backpack and looked like he belonged in this wilderness in a way that Sarah envied. Jake! I didn't expect to see you here, Sarah said, her heart racing from both surprise and something else she couldn't quite name. This is one of my favorite spots, he said, settling onto a fallen log that served as an informal bench. I come up here when I need to think or when I'm working on a new design and need inspiration. Sarah joined him on the log, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to catch the scent of pine and something earthy that seemed to cling to his clothes. What kind of designs? Furniture, mostly. I make custom pieces, tables, chairs, cabinets. I work with wood that I harvest and mill myself, try to honor the natural grain and character of each piece. The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself genuinely interested. That sounds incredibly fulfilling. Do you sell your work locally? Jake nodded. I have a few pieces in some galleries in Seattle and Portland, but mostly I work on commission. People who want something unique, something made with care rather than mass-produced. Sarah thought about her own work, creating campaigns to convince people to buy things they probably didn't need, often products that would be discarded and replaced within a year. The contrast was stark and somewhat unsettling. "How did you get into woodworking?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the valley below. "My grandfather taught me. He built the house I live in now, made all the furniture by hand. When I was a kid, I spent summers with him, learning to use the tools and understand wood. He always said that working with your hands connects you to something real, something lasting." "Where did you grow up?" "Texas, originally. My parents had different ideas about what I should do with my life. They wanted me to follow a more conventional path: college, corporate job, the whole package. We didn't see eye to eye on much." Sarah heard something in his tone that suggested there was more to that story, but she didn't press. Instead, she found herself sharing something she rarely talked about with anyone. "I understand family pressure," she said. "My parents emigrated from Mexico when I was young. They sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. I became successful in the traditional sense, but, lately, I've been wondering if I chose the right path or just the path that looked right to everyone else." Jake turned to look at her, and Sarah was struck again by the intelligence in his green eyes. "What would you choose if you could start over?" It was such a simple question, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized she didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any business presentation she'd ever given. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I've been so focused on achieving what I thought I wanted that I never stopped to ask myself what I actually needed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the valley and listening to the wind in the pines. Sarah felt a peace she couldn't remember experiencing in years. There was something about Jake's presence that made her feel safe to be honest, to let down the guard she'd maintained for so long. "I should probably head back," Sarah finally said, though she was reluctant to break the spell of the moment. "Me too," Jake agreed, standing and shouldering his pack. "Will you be staying in Pine Ridge much longer?" "I'm not sure," Sarah said truthfully. "My work here is essentially finished, but..." "But?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm finding reasons to stay." Jake's smile was warm and understanding. "Well, if you do decide to stay another day or two, there's a harvest festival this weekend. The whole town comes out for it: food, music, dancing. It's not fancy, but it's genuine." "That sounds nice," Sarah said, and meant it. As they parted ways at the parking area, Jake hesitated beside his old pickup truck, a weathered Chevy that had clearly seen better days but appeared to be lovingly maintained. "Sarah," he called as she reached her BMW. "For what it's worth, I think you're asking yourself the right questions now. That's more than most people ever do." Driving back to her hotel, Sarah found herself thinking not about the marketing campaign or her responsibilities back in Seattle, but about the way Jake's face had looked when he talked about his work, the genuine kindness he'd shown to Helen, and the comfortable silence they'd shared overlooking the valley. That evening, Sarah called her assistant and extended her stay in Pine Ridge through the weekend. For the first time in years, she was making a decision based on what felt right rather than what looked right on paper. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. As she fell asleep in the cozy room at the Pine Ridge Inn, Sarah found herself looking forward to the Harvest Festival with an anticipation she hadn't felt since she was a child. She didn't know what the weekend would bring, but, for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out. Outside her window, the mountain town settled into its quiet evening rhythm, unaware that a successful city woman was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about happiness, success, and what it meant to build a meaningful life. In a small cabin up in the hills, Jake Morrison was working late into the night on a new piece, a dining table made from reclaimed pine, and finding his thoughts drifting to the intelligent, vulnerable woman who had looked at his world with such curious, searching eyes. Neither of them could have predicted that this chance meeting in a small mountain cafe would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they believed about love, success, and the courage it takes to choose an authentic life over a comfortable one. The Pine Ridge Harvest Festival was everything Jake had promised and more. Main Street had been transformed into a vibrant celebration of the community's agricultural heritage, with colorful booths selling everything from fresh apple cider to handmade quilts. The air was filled with the sounds of bluegrass music, children's laughter, and the gentle hum of neighbors catching up with one another. Sarah had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her outfit that morning, finally settling on dark jeans, hiking boots, and a soft sweater in autumn orange, clothes she had packed almost as an afterthought but that now felt more appropriate than any of her business suits. As she walked down Main Street, she felt eyes on her, but the looks weren't unfriendly. Instead, she sensed curiosity and the kind of welcoming interest that small communities showed to newcomers. She found Jake at a booth displaying beautiful handcrafted furniture, speaking with an elderly couple who were admiring a rocking chair. Sarah hung back, not wanting to interrupt, but found herself captivated by watching Jake in his element. He spoke about the chair with quiet passion, explaining how he'd selected the maple specifically for its grain pattern and how he'd shaped the rockers to provide the perfect gentle motion. "The wood tells you what it wants to become," he was saying. "My job is just to listen and help it get there." The couple purchased the chair, and Sarah watched Jake carefully wrap it and help them load it into their car with the same gentle attention he'd shown Helen at the cafe. When he turned and saw Sarah approaching, his face lit up with a smile that made her stomach flutter. "You came," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "I told you I would," Sarah replied, then gestured to his booth. "This is incredible work, Jake. I had no idea." The furniture on display was unlike anything Sarah had seen in high-end stores in Seattle. Each piece was clearly handmade, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. A dining table made from what appeared to be reclaimed barnwood had been finished to a silky smoothness that begged to be touched. A set of chairs showed subtle variations that spoke of individual attention rather than mass production, and a large bookshelf seemed to grow organically from a single piece of oak. "Thank you," Jake said simply. "Would you like to see more? My workshop is just a few miles up the mountain." Sarah's heart skipped at the invitation. "I'd love to." They spent the rest of the morning wandering through the festival together. Jake introduced Sarah to seemingly everyone in town: the baker who made the best cinnamon rolls in the county, the local librarian who had taught 3 generations of children to read, the mechanic who could fix anything with an engine and had been Jake's first friend when he'd moved to Pine Ridge 5 years earlier. Everyone they met was genuinely friendly, but Sarah began to notice something else in their interactions. There was a respect for Jake that went beyond simple neighborliness. When Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her kitchen faucet was acting up, Jake immediately offered to stop by and take a look. When the festival organizers realized they needed an additional table for the pie contest, Jake disappeared and returned 20 minutes later with a perfectly sized wooden table from somewhere. "You're like the town's unofficial handyman," Sarah observed as they walked toward the food booths. Jake shrugged. "People helped me when I first came here. It's just returning the favor." But Sarah sensed there was more to it than that. She was beginning to understand that Jake's generosity wasn't calculated or performed for recognition. It seemed to come from a genuine desire to take care of his community. They shared lunch at a picnic table overlooking the small stage where local musicians were performing. The food was simple: barbecued pulled pork, coleslaw, cornbread, but it tasted better than meals Sarah had eaten at 5-star restaurants. Maybe it was the mountain air, or maybe it was the company, but everything seemed more vivid and real than her usual experiences. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said as they watched a group of children dancing to the music. "Sure. When you moved here from Texas, was it difficult to start over? To build a new life in such a different place?" Jake considered the question carefully. The hardest part wasn't the practical stuff, finding a place to live, establishing the business. It was learning to trust that this could be enough. "I'd spent so many years thinking I needed to prove something, to achieve some external measure of success. It took time to believe that a simple life could be a full life." "What made you realize you could trust it?" "My first winter here," Jake said, his eyes growing distant with memory. "I was living in a cabin I'd rented while I figured out my next move. The power went out during a blizzard, and I was stuck for 3 days with no electricity, no internet, no connection to the outside world. At first, I panicked. Then, I realized I had everything I needed: wood for the fire, food, books to read, and complete silence. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't anxious about anything. I wasn't checking my phone or worrying about what I should be doing. I just existed. It was the most peaceful 3 days of my life. Sarah tried to imagine being disconnected for 3 days without feeling panicked. The thought alone made her want to check her phone, which she'd been unconsciously avoiding all morning. That sounds terrifying to me, she admitted. It would have terrified me too, before I experienced it. Now I look forward to those quiet times. They remind me what's actually important. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the stage caught their attention. The afternoon's featured performer, a folk singer from Seattle, had apparently been delayed by car trouble. The festival organizers were huddled together, clearly trying to figure out how to fill the gap in the program. "Jake," called out Mrs. Patterson, the festival's main coordinator. "Could you help us out? Maybe play a few songs until our headliner arrives?" Sarah looked at Jake in surprise. "You're a musician too?" "Not really," Jake said, but he was already standing up. "I play a little guitar, but I'm not much of a performer." Despite his protests, Jake was soon on the small stage with an acoustic guitar, looking slightly uncomfortable in front of the crowd that had gathered. But, when he began to play, all of Sarah's attention focused on his hands moving across the strings with the same careful precision she'd observed in his woodworking. His voice, when he began to sing, was rich and warm, with a slight rasp that suggested he didn't perform often. He chose simple songs: Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire, a haunting version of Black by Pearl Jam, and, finally, an original composition that seemed to be about finding home in unexpected places. Sarah found herself mesmerized, not just by Jake's obvious musical ability, but by the way he seemed to connect with every person in the audience. He wasn't performing for them so much as sharing with them, inviting them into the songs rather than showcasing his talent. When he finished the short set, the applause was enthusiastic but warm rather than wildly excited, the response of a community appreciating one of their own rather than an audience impressed by a stranger's skill. "Why didn't you tell me you could do that?" Sarah asked when Jake rejoined her. "Because it's not really what I do," he said, seeming genuinely puzzled by her amazement. "I just play for fun sometimes." "Jake, you're incredibly talented. Have you ever thought about recording, or playing in Seattle?" "Or, no," Jake interrupted gently but firmly. "Music is something I do for myself and my friends, not for career advancement. The moment I start thinking about it as a business, it stops being joy and becomes just another source of stress." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand someone who possessed marketable talent but had no interest in marketing it. In her world, talent was something to be leveraged, optimized, turned into competitive advantage. The idea of keeping something precious simply for the love of it was almost incomprehensible to her. As the afternoon progressed, Jake suggested they head to his workshop. The drive up the mountain road took them through increasingly dense forest, with occasional glimpses of the valley below. Jake's property was accessed by a narrow dirt road that wound through tall pines before opening into a clearing that took Sarah's breath away. The house Jake had inherited from his grandfather was a work of art in itself. Built from logs and stone, it seemed to grow from the landscape rather than imposing upon it. A wraparound porch offered views in every direction, and the entire structure had a sense of permanence and belonging that spoke of deep roots and careful maintenance. "Jake, this is beautiful," Sarah said as they parked near the house. "My grandfather built it himself in the 1960s. He was an engineer by training, but he loved working with his hands. This place taught me everything I know about craftsmanship and patience." The workshop was located in a separate building about 50 yards from the house, connected by a well-worn path through the trees. When Jake opened the large wooden doors, Sarah stepped into a space that felt like a cathedral of creativity. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through skylights onto workbenches lined with hand tools that looked both well-used and meticulously maintained. The air smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and partially completed furniture pieces in various stages of construction filled the space. "This is where the magic happens," Jake said with a slight smile. Sarah walked slowly through the workshop, running her hands over smooth wood surfaces and marveling at the precision of Jake's work. A partially completed dining table dominated one corner, its grain pattern flowing like water across the surface. "How long does it take to make something like this?" she asked. "That table?" "About 6 weeks, working a few hours each day. I harvested the tree myself last spring. It was a cherry that had been damaged in a storm. I had to mill the lumber, dry it properly, design the piece to honor the natural characteristics of the wood, then cut and shape every joint by hand." Sarah thought about her work in marketing, where campaigns were developed in days or weeks and success was measured in immediate metrics. The idea of spending 6 weeks creating a single piece of furniture, with no guarantee of sale, seemed both foreign and deeply appealing. "Doesn't that make each piece incredibly expensive?" "I mean, if you factor in your time." Jake nodded. "My pieces aren't cheap, but the people who buy them understand they're purchasing something that will last for generations. This table will probably outlive both of us and serve families we'll never meet. To me, that's worth more than quick profits." As they toured the workshop, Sarah began to understand that Jake wasn't just making furniture, he was creating heirlooms, objects imbued with care and intention that stood in stark contrast to the disposable culture she was part of in Seattle. "Can I ask you something that might sound rude?" Sarah said as they sat on the workshop's small porch, sharing a beer Jake had retrieved from a vintage cooler. "Go ahead. How do you make enough money to live? I mean, if you only complete a few pieces per month, and you live in this amazing place." Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the forest that surrounded his property. "That's a fair question. The truth is, my overhead is low. I own this land outright, my grandfather left it to me. I grow a lot of my own food, cut my own firewood, and I don't have expensive tastes. A few good commissions each year cover my basic expenses, and anything beyond that is just extra." "But don't you worry about the future? About saving for retirement or health insurance or?" "I worry about some things," Jake acknowledged. "But not the way most people do. I figure if I can take care of myself and contribute something positive to the world, that's enough. The rest is just anxiety about things that might never happen." Sarah tried to imagine living with such confidence and simplicity. Her own financial planning involved complex investment portfolios, retirement accounts, and insurance policies for dozens of potential scenarios. The idea of trusting that enough could actually be enough was both attractive and terrifying. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake offered to cook dinner. Sarah accepted, curious to see yet another facet of this man who seemed to be capable of everything. Jake's kitchen was simple but well-equipped, with a wood-burning stove that he used to prepare what he called nothing fancy, grilled salmon he'd caught himself, vegetables from his own garden, and fresh bread he'd baked that morning. The meal was extraordinary, not because of sophisticated techniques or exotic ingredients, but because every component had been created with attention and care. They ate on the porch as stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd seen so many stars, or when she'd experienced such profound quiet. "I have a confession," Sarah said as they lingered over their wine, a bottle she'd brought from the hotel. "What's that?" "I'd been thinking about staying longer. Maybe taking some vacation time and just experiencing this for a while." Jake's smile was warm but cautious. "What's holding you back?" "Everything," Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My job, my apartment, my life in Seattle. People are expecting me back on Monday. I have meetings scheduled, deadlines to meet. My whole life is built around responsibilities that don't have anything to do with what I actually want." "What do you actually want?" It was the same question he'd asked on Lookout Point, but this time, sitting in this peaceful place with this man who seemed to have found a way to live authentically, Sarah felt closer to an answer. "I want to feel like my life has meaning beyond the next quarterly report. I want to wake up excited about my day instead of dreading it. I want to create something that matters, something that will last." She paused, looking at Jake in the gentle light from the porch lamp. "I want to understand how you built this life and whether it's possible for someone like me." Jake reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm and steady, and Sarah felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized had been churning. It's possible, he said quietly. But it requires giving up the idea that security comes from external things, money, status, other people's approval. Real security comes from knowing you can take care of yourself and the people you love, that you can find happiness in simple things, and that you have something meaningful to contribute to the world. How do you know if you have the courage to make that kind of change? You don't know until you try, Jake said. But, Sarah, the fact that you're asking these questions means you're already changing. The woman I met in the cafe 3 days ago was polite but guarded. Tonight, you're asking for the truth about what makes life worth living. That's not a small shift. As Sarah drove back to the Pine Ridge that night, her mind was spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. She thought about her apartment in Seattle, filled with expensive furniture that she'd never loved, and compared it to Jake's simple home, where every object seemed chosen with intention and care. She thought about her last relationship, which had been based more on mutual professional respect than genuine connection, and compared it to the ease she felt with Jake, the way conversation flowed naturally between them despite their different backgrounds. Most unsettling of all, she thought about her job, which had once felt like the pinnacle of achievement but now seemed like an elaborate game she no longer wanted to play. Back in his workshop, Jake was hand-sanding the cherry table by lamplight, a meditative activity that usually cleared his mind. Tonight, though, his thoughts kept returning to Sarah, her intelligence, her honesty about her dissatisfaction, and the vulnerability she'd shown in sharing her questions about her life. He'd learned to be cautious about getting involved with people who were searching for dramatic life changes. In his experience, the desire for a simpler life often faded when people realized how much work and sacrifice it actually required. But something about Sarah felt different. Her questions weren't about escaping responsibility, they were about finding responsibility that aligned with her values. Still, he knew better than to let himself hope for something that might disappear as quickly as it had arrived. Sarah belonged to a world that would call her back soon enough, and Jake had learned to be grateful for brief connections without expecting them to become permanent ones. Neither of them slept particularly well that night, both sensing that they were approaching a crossroads that would require choices with far-reaching consequences. In the morning, Sarah would have to decide whether to return to Seattle as planned or extend her stay indefinitely. Jake would have to decide whether to protect his heart or open it to the possibility that this time, someone might actually choose the mountain over the city. The Harvest Festival had been just the beginning. The real test would come when the fantasy of rural romance met the reality of two very different lives and the courage it would take to bridge the gap between them. Sarah's phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, but she couldn't bring herself to answer it. She knew without looking that her assistant, her boss, and probably several clients were wondering why she hadn't returned to Seattle as scheduled. Instead, she sat in the Pine Ridge Inn's small dining room, staring at her untouched breakfast and trying to find the courage to make a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. The bell above the inn's front door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Jake entering with Helen from the cafe. Both of them looked worried, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized they probably knew something she didn't. "Sarah," Helen said, approaching her table with the kind of gentle urgency usually reserved for delivering bad news. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been some folks asking about you." "What kind of folks?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "City folks," Jake said, taking a seat across from her. "They arrived about an hour ago in a black SUV with Washington plates. They're asking questions at the hotel desk and showing people your picture." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Did they say who they were?" "One of them claimed to be from your company," Helen said. "Said they were concerned because you'd missed meetings and weren't returning calls." "The other one?" She hesitated, glancing at Jake. "The other one what?" Sarah pressed. "He looked like a lawyer," Jake said bluntly. "Or maybe a private investigator. He was asking different questions about who you'd been seen with, where you'd been spending your time." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her old life crashing back into the peaceful bubble she'd created over the past few days. She should have known it was too good to last, too simple to be sustainable. "I need to call my office," she said, reaching for her phone. "Sarah, wait," Jake said, his hand covering hers. "Before you make any decisions, you should know that the whole town is talking about these guys."
They're not just asking questions, they're making demands, threatening to call the sheriff if people don't cooperate. Whatever's going on, it's bigger than just missing work meetings.
Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of any reason why her disappearance would warrant this kind of response. Yes, she'd missed meetings, but she was hardly indispensable.
Unless. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "Oh God," she whispered. "The Hartman account." "What's the Hartman account?" Jake asked.
Sarah was already dialing her assistant's number, her hands shaking. When Maya answered, her relief was audible.
"Sarah. Thank God. Where are you?"
"Mr. Garrett has been going insane, and there are people here saying they're going to find you and drag you back if necessary."
"Maya, slow down. What's happening with the Hartman account?" "The presentation was moved up to yesterday because Mr. Hartman is leaving for Japan early.
When you didn't show up and couldn't be reached, Mr. Garrett had to present your preliminary materials.
Hartman hated them and pulled the account. Sarah, it's a $12 million contract."
Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Hartman account was the biggest deal her company had landed in years, and she had been the lead on developing the campaign strategy.
Her disappearance hadn't just been an inconvenience, it had been a financial disaster.
"There's more," Maya continued. "Mr. Garrett is claiming that you've been acting erratically for months, that he's been covering for you.
He's saying you might be having some kind of breakdown.
There are rumors that the company is going to sue you for breach of contract and professional negligence." Sarah ended the call and sat in stunned silence. In the space of a few days, her attempt to find herself had apparently destroyed her career and potentially left her facing legal action that could wipe out her savings.
"That bad?" Jake asked gently.
"Worse," Sarah said, then explained the situation to Jake and Helen. As she talked, she felt her brief fantasy of a simpler life crumbling around her.
"I have to go back. I have to try to fix this." "Do you?" Jake asked.
"Or do you have to decide whether the life you're trying to save is worth saving?"
Sarah looked at him in disbelief.
"Jake, they're talking about suing me for millions of dollars."
"This isn't about life philosophy, this is about survival." "Is it? Or is it about fear?"
Before Sarah could respond, the inn's door chimed again, and two men in expensive suits entered. Sarah recognized one of them as David Chen, a senior partner at her company, and the other was indeed a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a legal thriller.
"Ms. Martinez," David said, approaching her table with what appeared to be barely controlled anger. "I think we need to talk."
Sarah stood up, her professional instincts taking over despite her emotional turmoil.
"Of course, David. Perhaps we could speak privately?"
"Actually, I think this conversation should be witnessed," the other man said, introducing himself as Robert Stone from the law firm that represented Sarah's company.
"Ms. Martinez, you're in serious trouble."
Jake stood up as well, and Sarah was surprised by how his presence seemed to change the dynamic in the room. Both men had clearly expected to find Sarah alone and vulnerable, but Jake's quiet confidence seemed to shift their approach. "Gentlemen," Jake said politely but firmly, "I don't believe you've been invited to sit down."
"This is a private business matter," David said dismissively. "It doesn't concern you."
"If it concerns Sarah, it concerns me," Jake replied calmly. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for Jake's support, but also a desperate need to handle this herself.
"It's okay, Jake. I need to deal with this." The next hour was one of the most humiliating of Sarah's life.
David and Robert laid out their case methodically. Sarah's disappearance had cost the company a major contract, damaged their reputation with other clients, and created a situation where they had no choice but to seek damages. They had documentation of her missed meetings, evidence of her increasingly erratic behavior, and witness statements from colleagues about her declining performance.
"The company is prepared to be reasonable," Robert finally said.
"If you return to Seattle immediately, complete the transition of your current accounts, and sign a settlement agreement acknowledging your responsibility for the Hartman situation, we might be able to avoid a public lawsuit."
"What kind of settlement?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Full repayment of your last 2 years' salary, plus damages equivalent to the commission on the Hartman account. Roughly $800,000.
Sarah felt the room spin around her. $800,000 was more than she had in savings, investments, and retirement accounts combined. Even if she sold her apartment and car, she would still be financially ruined.
And if I don't agree to the settlement?
Then, we pursue full damages through the courts, David said coldly. That would likely be closer to $2 million, plus legal fees.
Sarah, you were the lead on this account.
You disappeared without notice at the critical moment. There's no way to spin this that doesn't make you look negligent at best, criminally irresponsible at worst. Throughout this conversation, Jake had remained silent, but Sarah could feel his presence like an anchor in the storm. When David and Robert finally left, giving Sarah 24 hours to decide, she collapsed back into her chair feeling defeated and ashamed. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said to Jake, unable to meet his eyes.
"I guess you were right to be cautious about getting involved with someone like me." "What do you mean?" "Someone whose life is falling apart.
Someone who runs away from her responsibilities and, then, gets surprised when there are consequences." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than judgmental.
"Sarah, can I tell you something about my grandfather?"
Despite everything, Sarah found herself curious about this man who seemed to have shaped Jake so profoundly. He was an engineer, like I mentioned, but what I didn't tell you was that he worked for a major corporation in Houston for 25 years.
He was successful, respected, made good money.
Then, one day he came home and told my grandmother he was done. He'd realized that he was spending his life making other people rich while sacrificing everything that actually mattered to him.
What did he do?
He quit. Just walked away from his job, his pension, his career trajectory. My grandmother thought he'd lost his mind. Their friends thought he was having a midlife crisis. They came up here with their savings, bought this land, and built their life from scratch. Sarah felt a flicker of hope.
And it worked out? Not easily.
They struggled for the first few years. My grandmother had to take odd jobs while my grandfather learned to make furniture. There were times when they wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake.
But my grandfather always said that the hardest part wasn't the financial uncertainty, it was learning to stop caring about what other people thought of his choices.
Jake, I appreciate what you're trying to say, but my situation is different.
I can't just walk away.
I have legal obligations.
Do you?
Or do you have legal threats designed to scare you into compliance? Sarah stared at him.
What do you mean?
I mean, maybe you should talk to your own lawyer before you assume those men were telling you the truth about your options. The suggestion was so simple that Sarah was embarrassed she hadn't thought of it herself. In her panic, she'd accepted David and Robert's version of events without question, but they were hardly neutral parties. I don't have a lawyer, she realized. I mean, not one who handles this kind of thing.
I know someone who might be able to help, Jake said.
My grandfather's land purchase went through a lawyer here in Pine Ridge. She's retired now, but she still takes on cases that interest her.
Want me to call her?
3 hours later, Sarah found herself sitting in the living room of Margaret Chen, no relation to her company's David Chen, a 70-year-old woman who had spent 40 years practicing corporate law before retiring to Pine Ridge to write mystery novels. Margaret had agreed to review Sarah's employment contract and the company's claims as a favor to Jake, whose grandfather had been a close friend. Well, Margaret said, setting aside the documents Sarah had forwarded from her personal email, this is interesting.
Interesting how?
Sarah asked nervously. Your company is bluffing, dear. Oh, they're angry, certainly, and they did lose money when that client pulled out.
But their legal case against you is much weaker than they're pretending.
Margaret walked Sarah through the details with the kind of clarity that comes from decades of experience. Sarah's employment contract contained standard language about professional responsibilities, but nothing that would make her personally liable for client losses due to circumstances beyond her control. The Hartman presentation had been moved up without adequate notice, and Sarah had not been officially notified of the change while she was on what could reasonably be called emergency personal leave.
But, I didn't request personal leave, Sarah protested. Didn't you? Margaret smiled. You told your assistant you were extending your business trip for personal reasons related to family stress. That's documented in your email trail. The fact that your company chose not to have a backup plan for a major presentation isn't your fault, it's theirs. So I can't be held liable for the lost contract? Not in the way they're suggesting. Could they make your life difficult with a lawsuit? Certainly. Would they win? Very unlikely. More importantly, would they actually pursue it? I doubt it.
Margaret explained that lawsuits of this type were expensive, time-consuming, and likely to expose the company's own negligence in handling the situation. The threats were almost certainly designed to force Sarah into a settlement that would be far more costly to her than to them.
So what do I do? Sarah asked. That depends. Do you want to go back to your job?
The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that throughout this entire crisis, she hadn't once thought about whether she actually wanted to return to her career. She'd been focused entirely on whether she could return, whether she was allowed to return.
I don't know, she said honestly.
Then, here's my advice, Margaret said.
Don't make any decisions while you're scared. Take some time, think about what you actually want, and remember that you have more power in this situation than they want you to realize.
As they left Margaret's house, Sarah felt lighter than she had all day. The legal threats that had seemed so overwhelming that morning now looked more like desperate attempts at intimidation. She wasn't powerless, and she wasn't without options. "Thank you," she said to Jake as they walked back to his truck.
"I don't know what I would have done without your help today." "You would have figured it out," Jake said. "You're stronger than you think."
They drove back toward his property in comfortable silence, both of them processing the events of the day. As they reached the turnoff for Jake's road, Sarah found herself speaking without having planned what to say.
"Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me."
"Okay.
If I decided to stay, if I found a way to make a life here, would you want me to?"
Jake pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to look at her. In the late afternoon light, his green eyes were serious and searching.
"Sarah, I've been asking myself that same question for days. The honest answer is yes, I would want you to stay.
But only if you're staying for yourself, because this life genuinely appeals to you. Not because you're running away from something else, and not because you think a relationship with me is worth sacrificing your career for."
"What if it's all of those things?"
"Then, you need to untangle them and figure out which one is driving the decision. Because if you stay for the wrong reasons, you'll end up resenting this place and everyone in it, including me." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that life rarely presented choices that were clean and simple. Her feelings for Jake, her dissatisfaction with her career, and her desire to escape the pressure of her current situation were all tangled together in ways that might never be completely separable.
"Will you give me some time to figure it out?" she asked. "Take all the time you need," Jake said. "I'm not going anywhere."
That evening, Sarah sat on the porch of the Pine Ridge Inn, writing in a notebook she'd bought at the local general store. For the first time in years, she was making lists not of tasks to complete or goals to achieve, but of questions to consider and feelings to examine. What did she actually want her life to look like in 5 years? What kind of work would make her feel proud and fulfilled? What kind of relationship did she want to build, and with whom? If money weren't a consideration, how would she spend her days? The answers that emerged surprised her with their clarity. She wanted work that created something lasting and beautiful. She wanted a partner who challenged her to be authentic rather than successful. She wanted a community where people knew and cared about each other. She wanted to wake up excited about her day rather than dreading it. None of these things were compatible with her life in Seattle, but all of them seemed possible in Pine Ridge. The question was whether she had the courage to choose possibility over security, love over convention, and authenticity over achievement. As she sat writing under the inn's porch light,
Sarah didn't notice the figure watching her from across the street.
Robert Stone, the lawyer from her company, had decided to stay in Pine Ridge overnight to keep an eye on their problematic executive. What he was seeing, a successful urban woman voluntarily choosing to spend her evening writing in a notebook rather than frantically trying to salvage her career, was making him reconsider his assumptions about Sarah Martinez and her motivations.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices.
But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was writing the story of her own life rather than trying to live up to someone else's version of success. Sarah woke at dawn to her phone buzzing with an unknown number. Half asleep, she answered without checking the caller ID.
Ms. Martinez? This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates. I represent the Hartman Group.
Sarah sat up abruptly, suddenly, wide awake. The Hartman Group was the client her company had lost, the $12 million account that had started this entire crisis. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I should be speaking with you directly," Sarah said carefully. "There are legal issues, Ms. Martinez, please hear me out.
Mr. Hartman specifically asked me to contact you.
He's aware of the situation between you and your former employer, and he has a proposition."
Former employer.
Sarah noticed the lawyer's choice of words.
What kind of proposition? Mr. Hartman was very impressed with your preliminary work on his account.
He believes the campaign concepts you developed have significant potential, and he's interested in working with you directly.
Sarah's mind raced. I don't understand. He pulled the account from my company.
He pulled the account from your company because he felt they didn't understand his vision and couldn't execute your ideas properly. Your absence from the final presentation only confirmed his suspicion that the company wasn't properly supporting their most talented people.
For the next 20 minutes, Jennifer Walsh outlined an offer that seemed too good to be true.
The Hartman Group wanted to hire Sarah as an independent consultant to develop and implement the marketing campaign they had originally discussed. The contract would be worth $15 million over 2 years, paid directly to Sarah's consulting company, which she would need to establish.
But there's a condition, Jennifer added. Mr. Hartman wants to meet with you personally before finalizing the agreement. He's flying into Seattle this afternoon and would like you to join him for dinner.
Sarah agreed to the meeting, then sat in stunned silence after ending the call. In the space of one phone conversation, her entire situation had been transformed. Instead of facing financial ruin, she was being offered more money than she'd ever imagined earning. Instead of being unemployed, she had the opportunity to start her own business with a guaranteed major client. There was just one problem: accepting the offer would mean leaving Pine Ridge and returning to exactly the kind of high-pressure, client-focused work she'd been trying to escape. Sarah dressed quickly and drove to Jake's property, knowing she needed to talk through this development with someone she trusted. She found him in his workshop, already deep into his morning routine of hand-planning boards for a new project. "You're up early," he said, looking up with a smile that faded when he saw her expression.
"What's wrong?"
Sarah explained the phone call and the offer while Jake continued working, his hands never pausing in their steady rhythm. When she finished, he set down his tools and really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived.
"That's quite an opportunity," he said finally.
"It is," Sarah agreed.
"But I don't know what to do with it." "What do you mean?"
"I mean, yesterday I was ready to walk away from my career entirely, and today I'm being offered more money than I ever dreamed of making.
It feels like the universe is testing me."
Jake walked over to his workbench and picked up a piece of wood he'd been shaping.
"Can I show you something?"
He held up what appeared to be a simple board, but as Sarah looked more closely, she could see that it had been carved into a subtle curve that followed the natural grain of the wood. "When I first started woodworking, I thought my job was to force the wood into the shape I wanted. I'd fight against the grain, use clamps and pressure to make pieces fit together the way I'd planned. The results were technically correct, but they always felt wrong somehow."
Jake ran his hand along the curved board. "My grandfather taught me to work with the wood instead of against it. To look for what each piece wanted to become and help it get there. The results are stronger, more beautiful, and they last longer." Sarah studied the board, beginning to understand his metaphor. You think I should let this situation develop naturally instead of forcing a decision?
I think you should trust that the right choice will feel right, even if it doesn't look like what you expected. Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of a car approaching on the gravel road. Through the workshop windows, they could see a sleek black sedan making its way toward the house, clearly not a vehicle that belonged in these mountains.
Were you expecting someone? Jake asked.
Sarah shook her head, but, as the car parked near the house, she recognized the driver. Robert Stone, the lawyer from her company, emerged from the sedan and began walking toward the workshop. "Ms. Martinez," he called out, "I'd like a word with you." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances.
Yesterday's confrontation had been unpleasant enough, and Sarah couldn't imagine what Robert wanted now.
"Mr. Stone," Sarah said as they met him halfway to the house.
"I thought you'd return to Seattle."
"I had intended to, but some new information has come to light that I think you should be aware of." Robert's manner was different from the previous day, less aggressive, more cautious. He kept glancing at Jake as if unsure how to handle his presence.
"What kind of information?" "It concerns your new job offer from the Hartman Group."
Sarah felt her heart sink. Somehow her former company had found out about the offer and was probably going to claim it violated some non-compete clause she'd forgotten about.
"How do you know about that?"
"Ms. Martinez, your former employer has been monitoring your communications since you disappeared. When the Hartman Group contacted you directly, it raised some concerns."
Sarah felt a surge of anger. "You've been spying on me?" "Not spying. Protecting the company's interests." "But that's not why I'm here."
Robert glanced around the mountain clearing, taking in Jake's workshop, the handmade house, and the pristine wilderness that surrounded them. His expression was puzzled, as if he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing.
"Ms. Martinez, I need to ask you something directly. Are you involved with Mr. Morrison here?"
Sarah bristled at the intrusive question. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "It's my business because it affects the legal situation we discussed yesterday." Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but firm.
"Maybe you should explain what you're getting at instead of asking personal questions."
Robert looked uncomfortable, clearly not accustomed to dealing with people who didn't seem intimidated by his position.
"Mr. Morrison, our research indicates that you may not be what you appear to be." "Meaning?" "Meaning we know who you really are."
The words hung in the air like a challenge.
Sarah looked between Jake and Robert, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand.
"Who is he really?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photograph, a younger, clean-shaven Jake in an expensive suit, standing next to an older man in what appeared to be a corporate boardroom. "Ms. Martinez, meet Jacob Morrison, former heir to Morrison Holdings, one of the largest private timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. His family owns approximately 40,000 acres of forest land in Washington and Oregon, worth an estimated $200 million. Sarah stared at the photograph, then at Jake, feeling like the ground beneath her feet had shifted.
"Jake?" Jake's expression was resigned but not defensive. "We should probably sit down for this conversation."
The three of them made their way to the porch of Jake's house, where Sarah took a seat on the wooden steps she'd admired just days earlier. Now she found herself wondering if they were made from trees worth thousands of dollars each, cut from land that Jake owned rather than the simple mountain property she'd assumed. "The photograph is real," Jake said quietly.
"And, yes, I'm the heir to Morrison Holdings. But it's not as simple as Mr. Stone is making it sound. How is inheriting $200 million complicated?"
Sarah asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the forest that surrounded his home. When he spoke, his voice carried years of pain and difficult decisions.
"My father built Morrison Holdings from a small logging operation that belonged to his father.
By the time I graduated from college, it was one of the biggest timber companies on the West Coast. I was groomed from childhood to take over the business, sent to the best schools, trained in every aspect of the industry."
"So what happened?" Sarah asked.
"I learned what the business actually involved. Clear-cutting old-growth forests, fighting environmental regulations,
prioritizing short-term profits over sustainable practices. The company my father was so proud of was destroying the same landscapes that had made him fall in love with timber in the first place. Jake's voice grew more passionate as he continued. I tried to change things from the inside. I proposed sustainable harvesting practices, reforestation programs, partnerships with environmental groups. My father and the board saw those ideas as naive and financially irresponsible. So you left? I walked away. Told my father I wouldn't inherit a business built on environmental destruction. He was not pleased. Robert cleared his throat. What Mr. Morrison isn't telling you is that he didn't just walk away. He's been waging a legal battle with his family for 5 years to prevent them from harvesting the old growth sections of their holdings. The inheritance is tied up in litigation that could take decades to resolve. Sarah tried to process this information. So you don't actually have access to the money? I have a modest trust fund that covers my basic expenses, Jake said. The rest is frozen until the legal issues are resolved. But that's not really the point. What is the point? Jake turned to face Sarah directly. The point is that even if I could access that money tomorrow, I wouldn't want the lifestyle that comes with it. I've seen what wealth does to people, how it isolates them from real community and authentic relationships. This life, he gestured to the workshop, the garden, the simple house, this is what I choose, not what I'm stuck with. Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the man she'd grown to care about with this new information. Everything she'd admired about Jake, his contentment with simplicity, his rejection of materialistic values, now seemed potentially false, the affectations of someone who could afford to romanticize poverty because he had a safety net worth millions. Why didn't you tell me? She asked finally. Because I wanted you to know me for who I actually am, not who I used to be or who I might become legally. I wanted you to see this life and decide if it appealed to you, not get distracted by hypothetical wealth that I don't want and may never have access to. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There's something else you should know, Ms. Martinez. The Hartman Group's offer to you isn't entirely coincidental. What do you mean? Richard Hartman and Jake's father have business relationships going back 20 years. Hartman knows exactly who Jake is, and he's aware that you've been spending time together. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You think the job offer is some kind of setup? I think Hartman sees an opportunity to use you to get to Jake. If Jake were to inherit Morrison Holdings, it would make him one of the most powerful players in the timber industry. A partnership with Hartman Group could be worth billions. Sarah looked at Jake, who appeared as shocked by this revelation as she was. Did you know about the connection between Hartman and your father? I knew they did business together years ago, but I had no idea Hartman was still interested in my family's company. I certainly didn't know he was aware of our relationship. The three of them sat in tense silence, each processing the implications of these revelations. Sarah's mind was spinning with questions and doubts. Was Jake being honest about his rejection of wealth, or was he simply waiting for the legal issues to be resolved? Was the job offer from Hartman genuine, or was she being used as a pawn in some larger corporate game? Most unsettling of all, Sarah found herself wondering if her feelings for Jake had been based on false premises. She'd been attracted to his authenticity, his contentment with simplicity, his apparent freedom from the materialistic values that dominated her world in Seattle. If he was actually the heir to a vast fortune, even one he claimed not to want, did that change everything? I need some time to think, Sarah said, standing up abruptly. This is all too much. Sarah, please, Jake said, rising as well. Don't let this change how you see what we've built together. My family's money doesn't define who I am. Doesn't it? Sarah asked, her voice cracking slightly. Jake, I've been agonizing over whether I could afford to walk away from my career, whether I could build a life with someone who makes furniture for a living. Now I find out you're potentially worth more than I could earn in 10 lifetimes? How does that not change everything? Before Jake could answer, Sarah was walking toward her car, needing distance to process these revelations. As she drove back toward Pine Ridge, her phone rang with a number she recognized, Jennifer Walsh, the lawyer representing Hartman Group. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to confirm our dinner meeting this evening. Mr. Hartman is very much looking forward to discussing the opportunity with you.
Actually, Sarah said, making a decision that surprised her, I'd like to modify our meeting slightly.
Would it be possible for Mr. Hartman to meet me here in Pine Ridge instead of Seattle?
There was a pause.
That's unusual. May I ask why?
Because I want to have this conversation on neutral ground, and I want to understand exactly why Mr. Hartman is interested in working with me. I'm sure I don't know what you mean.
I think you do, Sarah said firmly. If Mr.
Hartman wants to hire me, he can drive to Pine Ridge this afternoon. If he's not willing to make that effort, then I'll assume his offer isn't as genuine as you've suggested. After a longer pause, Jennifer Walsh agreed to relay the message. Sarah spent the rest of the day walking through Pine Ridge, trying to sort through her emotions and decide what she actually wanted from her life and her potential relationship with Jake. As evening approached, she found herself back at the Mountain View Cafe, sitting in the same booth where she'd first noticed Jake just a week earlier. It felt like a lifetime ago, before corporate lawyers and timber fortunes and multi-million-dollar job offers had complicated what had seemed like a simple choice between two ways of life. The cafe's bell chimed, and Sarah looked up to see an impeccably dressed man in his 60s entering the humble restaurant. Even without an introduction, she knew this had to be Richard Hartman. He looked around the cafe with barely concealed distaste before spotting Sarah and making his way to her table.
Ms. Martinez, he said, extending a manicured hand.
Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, though I must say this is not what I expected. Please, sit down, Sarah said, studying this man who might hold the key to her professional future.
I appreciate you making the drive up here.
As Hartman settled into the booth across from her, Sarah realized that this conversation would determine not just her career path, but her understanding of who she was and what she truly valued. The next hour would reveal whether the opportunities being offered to her were genuine, or whether she was simply being used as a piece in a much larger game. Outside, Jake was walking down Main Street, wrestling with his own difficult decisions. He'd never intended to deceive Sarah about his family's wealth, but he also knew that money changed how people saw each other. The question now was whether their connection was strong enough to survive the complex realities that his inheritance represented, and whether Sarah would be willing to build a future with someone whose past was so much more complicated than he'd initially revealed. Richard Hartman ordered black coffee and spent several minutes studying the handwritten menu with the kind of polite distaste that wealthy people reserve for experiences beneath their usual standards. Sarah watched him carefully, trying to read the man who had potentially offered her financial salvation and professional independence. Ms. Martinez, he began finally, I must admit I'm curious about your choice of venue for our meeting.
When I offer someone a $15 million contract, they usually prefer to celebrate in more sophisticated surroundings. I wanted to meet somewhere honest, Sarah said directly. Somewhere we could have a real conversation without the usual corporate theater. Hartman's eyebrows rose slightly. Honest. That's an interesting choice of words. What makes you think our previous communication hasn't been honest?
Because I've learned that you have a business relationship with the Morrison family, and you know I've been spending time with Jacob Morrison.
That seems like relevant information that was left out of your initial offer. For the first time since entering the cafe, Hartman looked genuinely surprised.
You're remarkably well informed for someone who's been hiding in the mountains.
I haven't been hiding. I've been thinking.
And what I've been thinking is that your interest in hiring me might have less to do with my marketing abilities and more to do with my personal relationships.
Hartman leaned back in the booth, studying Sarah with new respect.
You're more direct than most people I work with.
Is that a problem?
On the contrary, it's refreshing.
Yes, Ms. Martinez, I'm aware of your connection to Jacob Morrison.
And, yes, that connection influences my interest in working with you.
But perhaps not in the way you think.
Sarah waited for him to continue, determined not to let herself be intimidated by his wealth or position. Jacob Morrison is the key to unlocking one of the most valuable timber holdings on the West Coast, Hartman said. But he's also one of the most stubborn, idealistic young men I've ever encountered. For 5 years, he's been fighting his own family to prevent the development of old growth sections that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
And, you think I can convince him to change his mind?
I think you might be able to help him find a solution that satisfies both his environmental concerns and his family's financial interests. Hartman pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a series of photographs, aerial views of vast forests, architectural renderings of what appeared to be an eco-resort, and detailed plans for sustainable timber operations.
What am I looking at? Sarah asked. A proposal I've been developing for the past 2 years. Instead of clear-cutting the Morrison holdings, I want to turn them into a showcase for sustainable forestry and ecotourism. Selective harvesting of timber, luxury eco-lodges that generate revenue without environmental destruction, and a research center for sustainable forestry practices.
Sarah studied the images with growing amazement. The proposal was sophisticated, environmentally responsible, and potentially very profitable. Why haven't you presented this to Jake directly?
Because Jacob Morrison won't take my calls.
His father and I have a complicated history, and Jacob sees me as part of the old guard that prioritizes profits over conservation. He's not entirely wrong about that, historically.
So you want to use me to get to him?
I want to hire you to develop a marketing campaign that could revolutionize how the timber industry approaches environmental responsibility. If that work happens to bring you into contact with Jacob Morrison and helps him see that there are alternatives to his current legal battle, then everyone benefits. Hartman paused to sip his coffee, making a face at what was clearly a brew far removed from his usual standards. Ms. Martinez, you're a talented marketing professional who's been wasted on conventional corporate campaigns. This project would let you work on something that could have real environmental impact while building your own consulting business. The fact that it might also help resolve a situation that's been tying up valuable resources for years is simply good business. Sarah found herself genuinely intrigued by the proposal, despite her suspicions about Hartman's motivations.
And, if Jake isn't interested? If he won't meet with you regardless of my involvement?
Then, you still have a $15 million consulting contract for the most innovative environmental marketing campaign in the industry.
Your relationship with Morrison is a potential bonus, not a requirement. Before Sarah could respond, the cafe bell chimed again.
She turned to see Jake entering, his eyes immediately finding her table. He approached with visible reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of confronting Hartman but unwilling to leave Sarah to handle the situation alone.
Mr. Hartman, Jake said, stopping beside their table. I heard you were in town.
Jacob.
You look well. Mountain life seems to agree with you.
The tension between the two men was palpable. Sarah could see years of family conflict and business disagreements in the careful politeness of their exchange.
May I sit down?
Jake asked, looking at Sarah rather than Hartman.
Sarah nodded, and Jake slid into the booth.